Finally, the Royal Air Force was a convert to the Doohay-Billy Mitchell theory that the quick way to win a modern war was to bomb the hell out of your enemy's civilian population, destroy their homes and their morale. While Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff were not entirely convinced that this could be done against Germany, they were determined to give it a good try. The British, accordingly, concluded that it would make no sense to invade the continent in 1942, perhaps to revive the agony of trench warfare, as long as there was any chance of persuading the Germans by other means into rising against Hitler and demanding peace. With the policy of bombing Germany into submission, General H. Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, was thoroughly in accord, but the other American service heads favoured a direct approach by ground forces and began pressing for a massive cross-channel operation to establish an army in France, thence to strike into the heart of Germany. The British admitted that this would have to be done eventually, but hoped to make it as painless as possible after a long stretch of bleeding Germany to death by air bombing and jabs around the periphery. This basic difference in British and American strategic thinking was never really resolved until victory crowned the necessary compromise. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially Marshall and King, continued to work for long-range commitments and a war of massed power aimed at the enemy's heart. The British Chiefs of Staff, always hoping that something would turn up to render a major continental campaign unnecessary, argued for a strategy of opportunism, attrition, and peripheral attacks. It had been agreed in March 1941 that Germany was to be number one enemy, even if Japan came in, but nothing had been decided as to how enemy number one was to be beaten. That was debated at the 3 weeks Arcadia Conference of the Combined Chiefs of Staff with President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in Washington in December 1941 and January 1942. Churchill came over with a plan in his pocket, of which the essence was: first, continue all possible material aid to Russia; 2, clear Axis forces out of Libya; and 3, invade Morocco and Algeria to clear Axis forces out of the rest of North Africa. This last, he argued, was essential, and Mr. Churchill finally had his wish, tough not without a great deal of argument by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the direct approach. His 3 weeks' stay at the White House, interrupted only by short trips to Canada and Florida, was beneficial for Anglo-American cooperation. The two leaders had met but once before, briefly at Argentia. They now had an opportunity to thrash things out and take each other's measure. In many ways, Roosevelt and Churchill were extraordinarily alike. It has been well said that each had more in common with the other than with his military advisers. But there was one essential difference. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not pretend to be an authority on military strategy. The Prime Minister Churchill did. Just as Jefferson Davis felt he knew more about strategy than Johnston or Lee, because he had been an officer in the Mexican War. So Churchill felt that his service in Queen Victoria's army, and subsequently as First Lord of His Majesty's Admiralty, made him an authority on strategy. It was often difficult for the British Chiefs of Staff to dissuade him from carrying out some of his peripheral plans for landing in Norway, Dakar, Rhodes, and so on. Roosevelt, too, would have enjoyed romantic military adventures, but he had a natural common sense on strategy, and his military advisers kept him on the straight and narrow. Both men were political maestros, adept at creating and using public opinion, and both had to deal with the opposition inevitable under democratic governments. Both, but Roosevelt to the greater extent, were regarded as traitors to their class, and hated by the sort of people with whom they had grown up. But both had the enthusiastic support of the masses. Never has there been such a team in coalition warfare as Winnie and Franklin Delano Roosevelt compared with the relations between these two. The principal protagonists in World War I, Lloyd George, Wilson, and Clemenceau, were mutually suspicious strangers, and Hitler and Mussolini were a pair of gangsters, each fearing the other would win the most loot. Before the Arcadia Conference met at Washington, the United States Army planners, led by General Embick, a member of the Supreme War Council during the First World War, had been doing some intensive thinking on ways and means of defeating Germany. After considering every possible method of getting at the heart of the Reich, they reached the conviction that the only way was to mount a large-scale Anglo-American assault in the British Isles and throw it across the Channel, the sooner the better. They were willing to contemplate small peripheral operations to blood American troops and do something, while preparing for the Great Push, but they opposed, as long as they could, a large-scale invasion of North Africa as a diversion which would draw off forces needed for the invasion of Hitler's heartland. The Arcadia Conference disbanded 14 January 1942 without deciding on any campaign for that year. But the British and American Joint Staffs continued planning as if the North African invasion would come off in May or June. The series of disasters in the Far East, the U-boat blitz, and the victories of Rommel over Auchinleck in Libya made this timetable impossible to keep, and on 3 March the combined Chiefs of Staff agreed to scrap it. In view of the beatings the Allies had already taken in Europe and in Asia, any invasion of North Africa must be done in sufficient force to ensure success. But where was the force to come from? The British agreed that we must place garrisons in Noumea, Fiji, Johnston and Palmyra Islands to guard the lifeline to Australia, and shipping was in short supply, shortly to become shorter thanks to the U-boats. On the combined Chiefs of Staff agenda, North Africa was now replaced by what was known as the Marshall Memorandum. This was a plan for 1. A cross-channel beachhead to be established in Normandy in 1942, Operation Sledgehammer, to be followed by 2. An all-out cross-channel offensive in 1943, Operation Roundup, and a push across the Rhine. This plan was accepted in principle by the British Chiefs of Staff on 14 April, after General Marshall and Harry Hopkins had gone to England especially to sell it. But as Marshall realised, this was not, from the British point of view, a firm commitment. The more they looked at it, the less they liked it, especially the 1942 curtain raiser. In any cross-channel movement that early, the major part of the troops would have to be British, so the United States could not insist. Large numbers of landing craft would be required, and although in the United States, Amphibious Force Atlantic Fleet was established with a training center at Little Creek, Virginia, and a construction program for tow 1,500 craft for Sledgehammer and 8,200 for Roundup was set up on 4 April. These had to compete with so many other urgent shipbuilding demands that the target date could not possibly be met. In May and June, events came thick and fast. Molotov visited both Churchill and Roosevelt to plead for a second front. Rommel captured Tobruk, which rendered action in North Africa urgent, and the War and Navy departments made frantic efforts to get more tanks and planes to the British in Egypt and to the Russians by the dangerous Murmansk route. Churchill visited Washington again in June to tell Roosevelt flatly that England could not and would not undertake a cross-channel operation in 1942. That opened a crisis in Anglo-American relations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially Admiral King and General Marshall, felt that if the British would not set a firm date for a major invasion of Europe, we were entitled to renege on the Beat Germany First decision of 1941. This was to stop preparing for an invasion that might never take place and concentrate on the Pacific War. This proposed right-about-face in strategy would greatly have pleased General MacArthur, who in a long message to General Marshall of 8 May 1942 argued seriously that the Second Front should be established under his own command in the Pacific, where it would take the heat off Russia by seriously engaging the armies of Japan. But Japan was not then at war with Russia, nor would be until August 1945. Not only MacArthur, but King, Marshall and Secretary Stimson strongly opposed the launching of a North African invasion in 1942, as certain to divert and absorb men, ships, aircraft and material that would postpone the direct cross-channel assault indefinitely. The President himself decided that to turn our backs on Europe was too drastic. Before Churchill left Washington, they had convinced each other that something formidable must be laid on in the Atlantic theatre for 1942. Since the British would not accept Sledgehammer, an invasion of North Africa was the only practical alternative. On 24 July 1942, the combined Chiefs of Staff in London voted timidly and tentatively for Operation Torch, a simultaneous occupation of Morocco and Algeria, but to postpone a definite decision until mid-September. President Roosevelt, sick of this wrangling and procrastination, used his authority as Commander-in-Chief Army and Navy to make it definite next day. Churchill, naturally, accepted what he had wanted all along. On the 26th, General Marshall informed General Eisenhower that he was to be Commander-in-Chief Allied Expeditionary Force in North Africa. The torch was lit. This torch decision was one of the most momentous in the war. It set up what was supposed to be only a secondary front, but the force of logic, the natural desire to build on foundations that have already cost one dear, pulled more and more Allied forces into the Mediterranean theatre, over 1 million Americans alone. In consequence, the cross-channel operation was impossible before 1944, and we came measurably close to having it postponed another year. At this time, the Vichy government of France was in control of French Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. No de Gaullist movement had developed there, and no German armed forces were in occupation. Spanish Morocco, opposite Gibraltar, was under Franco's control and so neutral. Libya or Tripolitana, the Italian colony between Tunisia and Egypt, was the battleground between Rommel and Auchinleck, who checked the Germans at the First Battle of El Alamein on 2 July, and was then relieved by the colourful Montgomery, because Churchill felt that Auchinleck had not done well enough. Egypt, nominally independent, was still under strong British occupation and control. On the north side of the Mediterranean, Gibraltar was British, Spain neutral, southern France neutral under Vichy. Italy, the Balkans and Greece were under Axis control. Malta, after a heroic defence, held firm, and continued an indispensable strategic base for the Allies, and a thorn in the Axis. The declared objectives of Operation Torch were to gain control over French Morocco, where the one modern port, Casablanca, offered an excellent base for anti-submarine warfare, and of Algeria and Tunisia as bases for further operations against the Axis. Planning began immediately at combined headquarters in Norfolk House, London. General Eisenhower arrived there in early August. Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham was appointed Allied Naval Commander. D-Day was set for 8 November, the very latest date in the fall when amphibious landings on the iron-bound outer coast of Morocco were considered possible. The entire operation was broken down as follows: 1 Western Naval Task Force, Rear Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, lifting and covering Western Task Force United States Army, Major General George F. Patton, consisting initially of about 35,000 troops. This all-American section of Torch was mounted at Norfolk, Virginia. Owing to its geographical separation from the rest of the operation, Western Naval Task Force was given a free hand by Eisenhower and Cunningham. It was divided in 3 groups for as many separate landings. Northern, Rear Admiral Monroe Kelly, to land at Mehedia and thrust up the Wadi Cebu to Port Lyautey. Centre, Captain Robert R. M. Emmett, to land at Fethala near Casablanca, and Southern, Rear Admiral Lyall A. Davidson, to land at Safi. 2. Centre Naval Task Force, escorted and covered by the Royal Navy, about 39,000 American ground forces, mounted in the United Kingdom, to capture Oran in Algeria. 3. Eastern Naval Task Force, about 23,000 British and 10,000 American troops, mounted in the United Kingdom, escorted and covered by the Royal Navy, to capture Algiers. We shall have most to say about the Western Naval Task Force, as it was all American, and many of its doings were original, almost fantastic. Except for the landings at Guadalcanal in August, this was the first amphibious operation conducted by the United States in 45 years, and it is no exaggeration to say that it was one of the boldest ever undertaken. Amphibious operations are divided into 2 main categories, of which the most common is the shore-to-shore. In this, the troops are lifted a short distance in landing or beaching craft, which take them directly to the beaches, as for instance in Operation Neptune Overlord, the great cross-channel movement of June 1944. In the other kind, ship-to-shore, of which Torch is a good example, the troops are lifted over long distances in transports and put ashore in small landing craft that the big ships carry on deck. This was the first time in history that a ship-to-shore operation had been projected across an ocean. It was extremely risky. There was danger of attack by the yet unmastered U-boats during the ocean passage and while unloading. There was danger from high surf at the target. All landing places faced the Atlantic surges. The beaches selected were commanded by coast defence guns. The French had plenty of ground, air and naval forces to defend their positions in Morocco, and nobody knew what their attitude would be. Secret diplomacy had been at work for months to persuade the French there to welcome us as liberators. But they were all under command of Marshal Pétain at Vichy, and nobody knew whether he would respond to German pressure or to Allied persuasion. One of the most amazing things about this bold operation was the secrecy with which so great an expeditionary force, 107 sail in the Western Task Force alone, and even more in the two others, was assembled and transported. The Germans knew that something was in the wind, but never guessed what. Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force they knew nothing of, and by careful work with high-frequency direction finder, the Navy was able to spot all U-boats then in the Atlantic and route this great force so that it avoided them all. Nevertheless, after it arrived, some U-boats slipped silently in to make easy kills. All troops of the Western Task Force embarked at Norfolk, and with a strong naval escort sorted 23 October. The air group, carrier Ranger and converted escort carriers Suwannee, Sangamon, Santee and Chenango, commanded by Rear Admiral Ernest D. McWhorter, sorted from Bermuda and joined at longitude 50° west on the 28th. There were 2 fuelings at sea, and every ship was a floating school of amphibious warfare. Nobody on board had ever participated in such an operation, and very few had even been in combat. On 7 November the sun set at 5:45 p.m., and enough stars appeared for a fix. At 11 p.m. Commander James M. Lane, navigator of Brooklyn, in which your historian sailed, announced that we were closing High Barbary. Africa was never so dark and mysterious to ancient sea rovers as she seemed that night, veiled in clouds and hushed in slumber. Not a light gleamed, not a dog barked, but the wind came offshore, blowing out to the ships the smell of charcoal smoke and of parched dry grass. What countless stratagems of this sort have been practised on this very coast since remotest antiquity. We might have been Portuguese caravels, with sails furled and yards on deck, waiting for the pole star clock to register 2 hours before dawn to move in and slaughter infidels. It has always been thus. You want a couple of hours' darkness to land and surprise the enemy, and then daybreak, so you can tell friend from foe, gold from brass, and wench from wife. At a quarter hour before midnight, flagship Augusta signalled stop, and the transports coasted into their planned unloading positions off Cape Fedala, 8 minutes in advance of schedule. Before 8 bells ushered in 8 November, one could hear the clank and clash which told one that the transports were already lowering landing craft. An hour passed. Assault troops were now leaping ashore, rifles in hand, running up the beach and striking for their first objectives. A searchlight shot up from ashore, and then another. The French had heard the humming of landing craft engines and thought they were planes. At morning twilight, Brooklyn moved toward her fire support position to knock out a powerful coast defense battery known to Americans as the Cherokee. It and other shore batteries opened fire on us. A few moments later, there came over the air from the flagship Admiral Hewitt's long-anticipated signal for a general engagement. Playball, this little corner of the world, so dark and silent for 5 long hours, was now split with blinding gun flashes, shattered by machine gun fire, shaken by the crash of heavy ordnance. It was essential to silence batteries at each end of Fedala as they enfiladed the beaches and their approaches. Brooklyn scored a direct hit on one of the 4 guns at Cherokee and another on the fire control station. Ground troops then moved in. The batteries on Cape Fedala were harder to find and still more difficult to knock out. They opened up intermittently on the landing craft and killed several men. But the landings went on, wave after wave of small craft, until by 5 p.m. on D-Day, 8 November, 7,750 officers and men were ashore. French resistance here was almost nil, but surf, a falling tide and inexperienced crews brought heavy damage to landing craft. Some 150 out of a total of 350 were expended. From 6:15 a.m., when it was barely light enough to launch planes, the Navy's carrier-based aircraft began to fight. Rangers Wildcats destroyed grounded planes at the 3 principal French airdromes in Morocco, while her dive bombers hit the submarine basin in Casablanca harbour, and both took part in the naval actions we are about to relate. Suwannee, commanded by Captain Jocko Clark, handled combat air and anti-submarine patrol for the centre group. Shortly after 7 a.m. opened the first phase of the naval battle of Casablanca. This was a fight between Admiral Giffin's covering group, battleship Massachusetts, heavy cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, and 4 8-inch coast defence guns of El Hank Battery near the Casablanca lighthouse, aided by French battleship Jean Bart immobilised in the harbour. The shore battery was only silenced temporarily, but Jean Bart, whose 4 15-inch guns might have raised havoc in the transport area off Fedala, was silenced for the day. The next phase began at 8:15 a.m. when Contre-Amiral Michelier, commanding French naval forces at Casablanca, took advantage of a moment when Giffin's big ships were 16 miles offshore to hurl his 7 destroyers at the American transports. Even at this late hour, the French did not know whether the ships landing troops on their soil were German, British, or American, and they didn't much care. The French Navy's honour was at stake. It was determined to fight. The sortying destroyers made a few hits on landing craft and destroyer Ludlow, but before they could reach the vulnerable transports, they were engaged by Augusta, Brooklyn, and 2 destroyers. The French ships, led by Contre-Amiral Gervais de Lafont in destroyer leader Milan, put up a stout and clever fight, laying a thick smoke screen in and out of which they dodged to shoot. But they were too few and feebly armed, even when assisted by light cruiser Primogay, and by 8 submarines which had escaped the earlier bombardment of their mooring basin. American gunfire was faster, heavier, and more accurate, and carrier-based aircraft had command of the air. Destroyers Fougueux and Boulonnais blew up and sank. Primogay took a bad beating from the cruiser's gunfire, and was later finished off by air bombing. Brestois and Frondeur met the same fate. A hit by El Hank Battery on Wichita, which wounded 14 men, was the only lethal one received by the American ships before action broke off at 11:45 a.m. The final score for this day of battle was very one-sided, but by the day's end the French Navy had plenty of fight left. El Hank was still intact, and the 15-inch guns of John Bart were again ready for action. The objective of the Northern Attack Group, commanded by Rear Admiral Kelly in battleship Texas and carrying about 9,000 men, mostly of the 9th Infantry Division under General Truscott, was to capture the important airdrome of Port Lyautey, several miles up the shoal and winding Wadi Sebu. Escort carrier Sangamon carried the fighter and bomber components, and her sister ship Chenango stood by waiting for a chance to fly army planes to the airdromes. It was assumed that the town of Mehedia, with an ancient but well-fortified Kasbah citadel at the mouth of the Cebu, must be taken before the river could be used. The Kasbah took the initiative at 7 a.m., shelling boat waves and transports, forcing transports to pull out to a point some 15 miles offshore. The result, as General Truscott reported, was that the landings were turned into a hit-or-miss affair, which would have spelled disaster against a determined enemy. The French here were too strong, some 3,500 Moroccan Zirailleurs and foreign legionnaires and 14 tanks, and were alerted too early, and our troops got ashore too late to have a walkover as at Fedala. The Kasbah, despite efforts of cruiser Savannah, did not fall until 10 November and then to the army, the leading naval exploit. Of this attack was the gallant passage of destroyer Dallas. Lieutenant Commander Robert Brodie, a 22-year-old four-piper, up the Cebu. After her net-cutting party had severed the stout wire of the boom at the river mouth, Dallas, carrying a raider detachment of 75 men and guided by a local French pilot, crashed through the rest of the boom at first light 10 November, under fire from the Kasbah, threaded her way between sunken hulks, dragged her keel through the soft mud of the river bottom, silenced French guns that fired at her, and landed her raiders without a casualty. Cooperating with a battalion of the 2nd Armored Division United States Army, which marched overland, the raiders captured the airdrome in short order, and by 10:30 a.m. it was being used by P-40s from Chenango. Everything clicked in the southern attack on Safi, a little town at a gap in the cliffs 150 miles south of Casablanca, where the French had constructed a small artificial harbour. It was selected as objective partly to box off French forces in southern Morocco, but mainly as the one place to land tanks. One quay in the harbour was long enough and the water alongside deep enough to berth tank carrier Lakehurst, a converted sea train. She had to be used, as no landing ship tank had been completed in time to take part in this operation. There was no other harbour in Morocco that she could enter, except Casablanca, and it was for the capture of Casablanca that these tanks were wanted. The harbour and all possible beaches were well covered by French artillery. To permit Lakehurst to enter and discharge her tanks, 2 1919 vintage destroyers, Bernadou, Lieutenant Commander R.E. Brady and Lieutenant Commander G.G. Palmer were shorn of most of their superstructures, and loaded with 350 assault troops to rush into the harbour and take it over before daylight. It worked. Bernadou, guided by Ensign J.J. Bell in a rubber scout boat, was just entering the harbour for November 8 when the French shore artillery started giving her the works. Cruiser Philadelphia and battleship New York then started throwing 6-inch and 14-inch shells at the Batterie Raileuse, 4 130mm coast defence guns north of the town, which was making most of the trouble. Bernadou miraculously came through unhurt, sweeping the jetties and piers with machine gun fire, and grounded near the harbour head. Her assault troops clambered down landing nets onto the rocks, and a few minutes later were chasing foreign legionnaires away from the water's edge. Cole followed with landing craft trailing, and tied up at a quay. The town of Safi was captured by the raiders. Marrakech Airdrome was neutralised by flyers from escort carrier Santi, and in the afternoon Sea Train Lakehurst made a dignified entry and began discharging tanks. They started rumbling along the road to Casablanca on 10 November, but before they had got very far, word came through from Admiral Darlan that this little Franco-American war was over. General Patton's staff on 10 November had drawn plans for an all-out assault on Casablanca next day, and Contre-Amiral Michelier had prepared for desperate resistance. But at 7 a.m. November 11, 15 minutes before this attack was to start, the French army commander sent Patton a flag of truce. He had received a ceasefire order from Admiral Darlan at Algiers. This was the result of protracted negotiations between that French Admiral Marshal Pétain's second-in-command in the Vichy government, Robert Murphy of the American Foreign Service, and General Mark Clark. Darlan's order, issued at 11 a.m. November 10, brought peace between French and Allied forces in North Africa, but plenty of trouble for metropolitan France. There was no surrender, no transfer of sovereignty, merely a ceasefire which developed into full cooperation between Allied and French authorities, military and civil. The French naval administration at Casablanca immediately placed port facilities, installations, tugs, pilots and divers at our disposal. Thus, after 3 days' sharp fighting, the traditional friendship was renewed under the happiest circumstance of making common cause against the Axis powers. But we had not yet heard from the Axis. On the evening of 11 November, 15 transports and cargo ships of Admiral Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force were still at anchor in Fedhala roadstead. U-173 worked in between them and the shore, evading their screen and a protective minefield. It torpedoed and sank transport Joseph Hughes, then torpedoed but failed to sink Euler Winooski and destroyer Hambleton. The following evening, U-130, by using the same tactics, made 3 victims: transports Edward Rutledge, Tasker H. Bliss and Hugh L. Scott. Their cargoes were mostly lost, and over 100 men were killed or died of wounds. On the 15th, USS Electra was torpedoed about 17 miles off Fedhala by U-173, but more fortunate than her British namesake in the Java Sea, she did not sink. That U-boat hung around Casablanca too long for its health. Through good teamwork between destroyers Woolsey, Swanson and Quick, it was sunk off the harbour entrance on 16 November. By that time, almost every ship of Admiral Hewitt's group which had not departed was safely inside Casablanca harbour. As a definite seal to Darlan's ceasefire order of 10 November, the French admiral, secretly assured by Marshal Pétain of his approval, drew up a formal accord with General Eisenhower and Admiral Cunningham, which was ratified by Churchill and Roosevelt on the 15th. By virtue of this pact, Admiral Darlan became head of the civil government in North Africa, and General Giraud, who had escaped from a German prison and been brought to Gibraltar in a submarine commanded by Captain Gerald Wright, became head of the French armed forces in North Africa. This Darlan deal, denounced as a base truckling to Vichy by General de Gaulle and by British and American left-wingers, ensured French cooperation with the Allies, saved very many lives, and prevented an inestimable amount of sabotage and obstruction to Allied military operations. Simultaneously with Admiral Hewitt's landings in Morocco, and equally powerful and important, were those of American and British troops, escorted by the Royal Navy, near Oran and Algiers. Both forces were mounted in the United Kingdom, drawing on the United States Army contingents which General Marshall had hoped to use in a cross-channel operation. In the small hours of the morning of D-Day, 8 November, His Majesty's ship Heartland and Walney, former United States Coast Guard cutters transferred to the Royal Navy in 1941, dashed into Oran Harbor carrying a small United States Naval and Marine Guard, and 400 picked American troops. Unlike Bernadotte's assault on Safi, this enterprise was a dismal failure. The local French, alerted, raked both vessels with point-blank fire, sank them and killed about half their crews and passengers. The main landings of troops lifted by Centre Task Force, Commodore Thomas Trowbridge, the 1st Infantry Division and part of the 1st Armoured Division, United States Army, took place on 2 sets of beaches, each side of Oran. Those in the Gulf of Arzeau were noteworthy for the use of 2 British Maracaibos, shoal-draft oilers from Venezuela, fitted with a big bow ramp for landing tanks. These were prototypes of the famous landing ship tank. The 2 columns of troops converged on Oran, where all resistance ceased November. Algiers was taken by the Eastern Naval Task Force, Rear Admiral Sir Harold M. Burrow, lifting the Eastern Assault Force, comprising regimental combat teams of the 9th and 34th Infantry Divisions United States Army, and 2 brigade groups of the British Army, which here outnumbered the American contingent 2-1. This force, too, was mounted in the United Kingdom and escorted by the Royal Navy. 5 of the transports were American, one of which, Thomas Stone, was crippled by a U-boat's torpedo on 7 November off the Spanish coast. The ships, boat crews and troops of this force had had only a few days' amphibious training, with the result that the landing, though unopposed, was a complete foul-up. The same state of affairs characterized the unopposed landings from British transports west of Algiers. No fewer than 98 of the 104 landing craft used in all sectors of the Eastern Naval Task Force were expended, a loss so scandalous that the Army put in a bid for taking charge of all future landing operations. French resistance ceased in and around Algiers on D-Day, 8 November, but the Axis picked up the ball, and over a period of a week the big transports unloading were subjected to severe bombing and torpedo attacks by land-based Junkers and Heinkels. USS Leedstown was the principal casualty. She had to be abandoned and sank. As a result of this massive 3-pronged amphibious operation, North Africa west of Tunisia was denied to the Axis. Valuable airdromes, military, naval and anti-submarine bases were secured, and foundations laid for driving the Germans out of North Africa. The Royal and United States Navies had learned far more about amphibious operations than they ever could have done from the most prolonged training and rehearsal. Later assaults in the European theatre would have failed, but for the lessons learned in Torch. Those lessons were, 1. The need of better seamanship and design in small landing craft. The original plywood and rampless Higgins boat proved inadequate, and the Navy henceforth concentrated on building steel, diesel-powered and ramped types, such as the landing craft personnel, ramped landing craft, vehicles and personnel and landing craft, mechanized. 2. The pressing need of big beaching craft, the landing ship tank, landing craft tank and landing craft infantry, to bring in tanks, vehicles and large units of troops quickly. 3. From the Navy's point of view, the advisability of renouncing tactical surprise in order to deliver gunfire support and land by daylight, a point of view the Army was not yet ready to accept. Owing to the half-hearted, sporadic resistance offered by the French, we had yet to experience a stoutly contested amphibious operation. The Germans would provide that at Salerno and the Japanese at Tarawa before the end of 1943. Bold as Operation Torch was, and successful within its sphere, it could well have been a little bolder and secured Tunisia too, as Admiral Cunningham wanted. There the Germans beat us at the draw. Admiral Esteva, head of the French government in Tunisia, was well disposed to the Allies, but overpowered by German troops arriving by ferry plane. Frenzied efforts were made by the Germans to convert this country into an African bastion, since the British Army, led by General Montgomery, after winning the Second Battle of El Alamein on 3 November, was slowly and deliberately pursuing Rommel westward. This year, 1942, closed on a static situation in Tunisia. The Anglo-American First Army was bogged down in Algerian mud. Montgomery's forces were dusted down by sandstorms. The Germans had occupied the ports of Bizerta, Sousse, Sfax and Gabes. The Royal Navy, respecting the powerful air forces that the enemy had deployed, was not yet ready to challenge Axis control of the Straits of Sicily. Malta stood firm, but the Axis had won the race for Tunisia, The military campaign for Tunisia, which lies outside the scope of this volume, did not end until 13 May 1943. Axis forces 275,000 strong, which had been pushed into Cape Bon, then completed their surrender to American Second Corps Major General Omar N. Bradley and British Eighth Army General Sir Harold Alexander. On 17 May, the first Allied trans-Mediterranean convoy since 1941 left Gibraltar, and on the 26th it reached Alexandria without loss. The Suez lifeline now reopened. No longer did ships bound for the Indian Ocean and Australia have to round the Cape of Good Hope. If Torch put the Navy on its toes, the Tunisian experience was equally valuable for the army. There it learned how to fight seasoned German troops and developed the competence of corps and divisional commanders for a much bigger show. There, Generals Bradley and Patton first had a chance to prove their exceptional, though diverse, military qualities. In all three elements, ground, sea and air, British and Americans had learned how to win battles together. Thus, whilst one can argue that Torch was a mistake, and that the Marshall Plan of cross-channel operations in 1942 to 1943 should never have been allowed to lapse, almost everyone who studies the Tunisian campaign must conclude that the postponement was correct. We were simply not ready to launch, and still less to follow up, a massive assault on Festung Europa in 1942 to 1943. Since that had to be postponed, a question arose as before. What could the Allies do in 1943 to engage the Axis and take pressure off Russia? A plenary combined Chiefs of Staff conference with President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met at Casablanca between 14 and 23 January 1943 to consider that and other questions. This conference ended in a strategic compromise. The British removed their objection to America's exploiting the initiative she had won in the Pacific. America consented to take part in another Mediterranean operation and to postpone the cross-channel invasion until 1944. Both agreed that the defeat of the U-boat must remain a first charge on the resources of the United Nations, since if that failed, everything would fail. In consequence of that decision, the United States gave AAA priority to the construction of destroyer escorts, escort carriers, and anti-submarine aircraft, placing landing and beaching craft in a lower category. That is why a worldwide shortage of such craft occurred in 1944. Admirals King and Pound now persuaded the conference to make Sicily the next objective in order to secure the Mediterranean line of communications, increase pressure on Italy, and divert German forces from the Russian front. The conference also adopted a rough plan for Operation Husky, an Anglo-American invasion of Sicily for July 1943, with General Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, Admiral Cunningham Naval Commander, and Air Chief Marshal Tedder Air Commander. American strategists hoped that Sicily would put a stopper on Mediterranean campaigns, so that we could get on with the big cross-channel invasion. The British, on the contrary, looked on Sicily as another rung of the ladder to what Churchill called the soft underbelly of the Axis. Thus, as Admiral King predicted, once we started in the Mediterranean, we would have to go on, and the underbelly turned out to be boned with the Apennines, plated with the hard scales of Kesselring's armour, and shadowed by the wings of the Luftwaffe. The other important decision at Casablanca, and the only one made public, was a resolution to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and, by implication, Japan. The Prime Minister and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were jointly responsible for the principle, and Roosevelt for the publicity and the phrase, which he remembered vaguely from the history of the Civil War. It was received with joy and acclamation in the Allied countries, where it dispelled the fear of a darlan deal with Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito, or the adoption of something like a Wilsonian 14 points, the meaning of which could be argued indefinitely. The decision to utter this rallying slogan was not lightly made. The American, Russian, and British people, especially the last two, had suffered so severely that they had to be promised complete victory. No peace of Amiens, no mere truce which would leave Germany strong enough to start up again. And the Americans felt the same about Japan. But did not unconditional surrender help the Axis leaders to persuade their people to fight at Lutranz as the only alternative to virtual slavery? Possibly so, probably not. Italy's surrender in 1943 was highly conditional, and both the Nazis and the Japanese warlords, right up to the moment of their complete defeat, imagined that they could make a deal. In my opinion, unconditional surrender did not prolong the war a day, and can in no way be considered responsible for our post-war troubles. The Casablanca conferees, meeting in an atmosphere of euphoria following the success of Roku, had eyes bigger than their stomachs and laid out a strategic menu that they could not digest. Although Husky did come off at the target date, it was at the expense of other things: a quick follow-up in the Pacific after the securing of Guadalcanal and Papua, a drive from India toward Akyab in Burma, and the build-up of American forces in Britain for the now postponed cross-channel operation. Shipping was the bottleneck for everything, and Admiral Dönitz was doing very well in his efforts to squeeze that neck. In Chapter 5 above, we left the anti-submarine situation in June 1942 considerably improved, but it did not long stay improved. Dönitz started a new U-boat blitz in August, which reached its acme in March 1943. He now had echelons of wolf packs strung across all transatlantic convoy routes between Iceland and the Azores, especially in what we called the Black Pit outside the range of land-based aircraft. These tactics were exceedingly difficult to beat, and beaten they were not for 8 months. In August 1942, the Allies lost 102 merchant ships of over 500,000 gross tons to submarine attack in Atlantic and Arctic waters. Not one transatlantic merchant convoy escaped attack. During the next 4 months, an average of almost a ship a day was lost on the North Atlantic convoy routes, and sinkings in the Caribbean and among unconvoyed merchant ships trying to round the Cape of Good Hope, access to Suez still being closed, were also heavy. Although the convoy system had been extended, much transatlantic traffic was still carried in unescorted merchant ships with naval armed guards. Their fine fighting spirit is illustrated by the Battle of Liberty ship Stephen Hopkins, Paul Buck, master, with 2 armed German ships, Raider J armed with 6 5.9-inch guns, and blockade runner Tannenfels. These 2 attacked Hopkins at latitude 28 degrees south, longitude 20 degrees west, on 27 September 1942. Ensign K.M. Willett and his naval armed guard, operating the freighter's 1 4-inch gun, scored 35 hits on Raider J and forced her abandonment. After a German shell had exploded the magazine for Willett's gun, the ship's second mate and crew operated 2 37mm guns forward, firing at Tannenfels, which was raking their decks with machine gun fire, Captain Buck manoeuvring his ship so as to bring all possible gunfire to bear. This unequal battle continued for almost 3 hours, when Stephen Hopkins, aflame from stem to stern and holed below her waterline, plunged with colours flying. But Raider J had preceded her to the bottom. The one undamaged American lifeboat, without charts or navigation instruments, made the coast of Brazil after a voyage of 31 days, with only 15 men of the Liberty ship's crew still alive. In January, while the combined chiefs of staff and their guests were basking in the sunshine at Casablanca and planning great doings for 1943, one of the worst winters on record was lashing the Western Ocean. Hardly a day passed without snow squalls or bone-chilling rain. Heavy seas broke continuously over vessels' bows, icing their superstructures in the high latitudes. These conditions were even worse for merchant ships than for U-boats, which could get under. During most of the winter, the weather was so foul that long-range land-based planes could not fly, and several of those that did never returned. Merchant ship losses by marine casualty alone, for the 5 months November 1942–March 1943, reached the unprecedented figure of 92 vessels in the Atlantic, 166 for all parts of the world. Sinkings from U-boat attack reached an all-time high in November 1942, 106 ships of 637,907 gross tons. In January 1943, a convoy escorted by 4 British corvettes from Trinidad to Gibraltar lost 7 out of 9. As a sample, here is what happened to a couple of transatlantic convoys early in 1943. Westbound convoy on 166, 63 ships, escorted by Captain P.R. Heinemann's unit, comprising United States Coast Guard Cutter Spencer and Campbell, 5 British and Canadian corvettes, and Polish destroyer Burza between 12 and 25 February lost 7 merchant ships, but sank 2 U-boats, one by Spencer with depth charges, one by Campbell through ramming and gunfire, after Burza had depth charged it. The escort unit had barely entered the uneasy shelter of Argentia, Newfoundland, when it was ordered out, augmented by USS Greer, to take charge of eastbound convoy SC-121 of 56 ships. Thrice in 4 days, 6 to 9 March, this unfortunate convoy was set upon by wolf packs. At least 7 ships were torpedoed, and all but one sunk, with unusually heavy loss of life, including that of the British convoy Commodore. The sea was so rough that even Greer's veteran sailors on one occasion could not pick up survivors from lifeboats and rafts, and had to let them go. Both in this and the next slow convoy 122, which lost 9 ships, and in HX 229, which lost 11 ships on 8 to 10 March, there were numerous acts of heroism and self-sacrifice on the part of merchant seamen, as well as coastguardsmen and bluejackets. Few outside the 2 navies and merchant marines realized how serious the situation had become in March 1943. The U-boats, in this and other areas, sank 108 ships that month, totaling 627,000 tons, and lost only 15 of their number. So many Allied escort vessels were under repair that the group organization was disintegrating. So many U-boats were at sea, an average of 116 operating daily in the North Atlantic, that evasive routing was futile. A convoy avoided one concentration of wolf packs only to fall into the fangs of another. No enemy ever came so near to disrupting Atlantic communications as Duntis did that month. All this had a very damaging effect on Britain's imports. These, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had agreed early in 1942, must be kept above a certain norm in order to keep her people fighting, producing, and even eating. British imports, owing largely to the work of the U-boats, had declined from a pre-war average of over 50 million tons to 23 million in 1942, and by the end of that year Britain was eating her own tail. In November, Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised the Prime Minister to allot England enough newly built merchant ships to raise her imports to a marginal 27 million tons next year. But it was some months before this relief came forth, and as most of the follow-up torch convoys from the United Kingdom to North Africa had to be under the Red Ensign, food stocks in Britain fell off to a 3-month supply in January 1943. In order that England might not live from hand to mouth, Churchill reduced by half sailings to the Indian Ocean around the Cape, a drastic measure which brought Bengal to the verge of famine. It was, unfortunately, typical of the hit-or-miss methods of wartime administration that the Joint Chiefs of Staff first heard of the President's promise from Sir John Dill, the Combined Chiefs of Staff representative in Washington. Thus Lieutenant General Brecon Somervell of the United States Army Service of Supply attended the Casablanca conference both uninstructed and confused. He neither knew what the President had promised or what his country was able to do about it, and he made a fuzzy sort of agreement with his British opposite number, which might be interpreted that we were to give the British 300,000 tons of shipping, or 7 million tons. In March 1943, with the situation clouded by protracted German resistance in Tunisia and U-boat achievements in the North Atlantic, this misunderstanding blew up in everybody's face. To implement the President's promise would require, in April-June, 9 million tons of cargo ships to Britain for the rest of 1943. This also included 14 sailings per month to the Mediterranean to support Husky, and 25 sailings per month to the Indian Ocean for the planned drive on Akyab. Churchill wrote severely to Roosevelt, "We cannot live from hand to mouth on promises limited by provisos." Admiral King and the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt, on the contrary, that the important thing was to get on with the war. Britain must tighten her belt. A nasty situation was developing between the military heads of both countries, when President Roosevelt took it out of their hands and gave it to a special board of civilians, presided over by Harry Hopkins. On 29 March, Hopkins Lewis Douglas, then Deputy Chief of Warshipping Administration, and Sir Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Minister, met with the President at the White House. Douglas presented the case for maintaining the level of British imports if we wished to avoid weakening the entire war effort, He further declared that American armed services estimates of necessary shipping were generally inflated and that they wasted tonnage scandalously. Roosevelt decided in Britain's favour and gave strict orders that his November promise be implemented as it was. The British import programme rapidly revived, and in May the President directed the War Shipping Administration to transfer 15 to 20 new freighters a month to the Red Ensign. But this presidential promise could never have been kept, and the British people would have approached famine in 1943, but for a dramatic reverse of fortune in the anti-submarine war in April and May. First came success in anti-submarine operations. The glorious battle of a British escort group under Commander P.W. Gretton to westbound convoy Ep.5 is regarded both by the Allies and the Germans as a turning point in the North Atlantic struggle. Dönitz deployed no fewer than 51 U-boats to destroy this 42-ship convoy. The battle raged almost continuously in foul weather from 28 April to 6 May. 13 merchantmen, including 3 Americans, were sunk, but an escort that never numbered more than 9 ships sank 5 U-boats, and 2 Catalinas, 1 Canadian and 1 American, disposed of 2 more. This victory was followed by another in the Bay of Biscay offensive, which Air Vice Marshal Sir John Slessor of Coastal Command had been conducting since March. His plan was to train bomber planes based on southern England, operating in connection with Royal Navy corvettes, to catch U-boats going and coming near their French outports on the bay. Aircraft-mounted microwave radar, which the Germans could not detect, picked up surfaced U-boats at night, then the new Lee searchlight illuminated them, and if they were not sunk, a surface unit was homed in to do the job. In May 1943, the results of this Bay offensive, added to others, meant 38 U-boats sunk, 12 more than were built, and 3 less than the number of merchant ships lost in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. The Bay offensive, continuing to the end of the year with American liberators pitching in to help, broke the back of Dönitz's submarine campaign. There was also a vast improvement in organisation and method. On 1 May 1943, Admiral King organised 10th Fleet, with himself as Commander and Rear Admiral Francis S. Lowe as Chief of Staff, to combine all existing anti-submarine activities. Lowe, tough, intelligent and hard-working, was a perfect alter ego to King, who did not have the time to give this branch of warfare the detailed attention it required. He ruled with an iron hand, but had the respect of his subordinates, who were never allowed to doubt what he wanted and were never let down. The destroyer escort program finally bore fruit. Some 250 of these new escort vessels had been authorized in January 1942, but the shifting of priority work in American shipyards to beaching and landing craft for the cross-channel operation that never came off so delayed the program that by 2 June only 42 had been launched. They were now produced in such abundance that by December 260 destroyer escorts were in commission. There was a similar delay in building escort carriers. These escort carriers, capable of carrying about 24 operating planes, were badly wanted as additional protection to convoys. The first, USS Bogue, got into action in March 1943. At the same time, the production of land-based aircraft types suitable for anti-submarine work so increased that in the second half of 1943, the Navy was able to relieve the Army Air Force of anti-submarine duties which it had assumed at a time of desperate need. Liberators, PB-4Ys, same as the Army B-24s, had a radius of 900 miles from Newfoundland or the British Isles, and smaller bombers had a radius of 500 miles from Greenland or Iceland. But there was still a mid-ocean black pit, where no air protection could reach a convoy unless brought to it by escort carrier. This was not lighted up until late 1943, when Portugal gave the Allies permission to base anti-submarine planes on the Azores. Not even Mr. Churchill expected Operation Husky to be soft. As an historian, he knew that Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Byzantines, Saracens, Normans, Angevins and Spaniards in succession had had their will of this great and fair island, but each conquest had taken years to complete. Sicily had never been so defensible, at least in theory, as in 1943. It contained about a dozen airfields, and its garrison was formidable, at least on paper. The greater part of the island is mountainous, difficult to traverse except by main roads. The Strait of Messina is so narrow that reinforcements can easily be poured in from Italy. General Eisenhower, preoccupied with the Tunisian campaign and bedevilled by the rivalries of de Gaulle, Giraud and other French leaders in Africa, was unable to give much attention to planning Husky. Most of the essential work was done at Hewitt's and Cunningham's headquarters in Algiers, and General Patton's at Mostaganem, 165 miles distant, much too distant for proper planning. For D-Day, the night of 9 to 10 July was chosen because the moon set around 2:30 a.m. The Air Forces wanted moonlight for their paratroop drop, and the Army wanted darkness to commence landing at 2:45 a.m. 9 Allied divisions, 4 American, 4 British and 1 Canadian, were available for the initial assault, and about the same number of German and Italian divisions were expected to be on hand to oppose. The plan finally selected in mid-May, after much wrangling, provided for Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force to land on 3 sets of beaches near Licata, Gela and Scogliti on the southwest coast of Sicily, and the British to land on beaches around the southeastern cape of the island. Patton would drive across the island to secure Palermo, and then swing east to Messina, while Montgomery drove north to Syracuse, Augusta, Catania and Messina. This was a poor strategic plan, better calculated to push the Axis forces out of Sicily than to trap them in Sicily. But its chief weakness lay in the refusal of the United States Army Air Forces to cooperate, largely because General Toohey Spatz was wedded to the concept of strategic air operations, which meant the Army Air Force or forces fighting its own war. He planned to devote practically his entire strength to fighting the Luftwaffe and the Royal Italian Air Force. And not until 2 weeks before D-Day did Spatz even let Hewitt and Patton know that this was his intention. The Army Air Force or Forces and Royal Air Force opened this Sicilian campaign on 2 July with an implacable day and night hammering of enemy headquarters and of 10 or 12 Sicilian airfields, which were rendered temporarily unusable. But the amphibious expedition sailed and landed with no promise of tactical support from the air, and almost none did it obtain. An important air unit, which came under 7th Army, not the Army Air Force or Forces, and which greatly helped, was the 82nd Airborne Division, Major General Matthew B. Ridgway. This, the first paratroop division in the United States Army, made its combat debut in Husky. Its mission was to seize high ground and the Ponte Olivo airfield behind the landing beaches, confuse the defence and prevent a prompt counterattack on the beachhead. This division no more than the Navy could obtain night fighter protection from the Army Air Force. The Army Air Force or Forces did have night-flying fighter planes and pilots, but had other uses for them. The capture of Sicily was an undertaking of the first magnitude, as Churchill wrote. Measured by the strength of the initial assault, it breaks all records for amphibious operations. Even the Normandy landings next year exceeded it only if follow-up echelons are counted. Admiral Hewitt had 508 ships, and Admiral Ramsay had 795 ships under their respective commands. In addition, Vice Admiral Sir Algernon Willis commanded a Royal Navy covering force of 6 battleships, 6 cruisers and 24 destroyers. The nature of the operation was part ship-to-shore, part shore-to-shore, this last being made possible by the arrival in North Africa of the first big beaching craft, the 1,500-ton, 328-foot landing ship tank, including the 550-ton, 112-foot landing craft tank, and the 200-ton, 158-foot landing craft infantry large. The biggest of these, the landing ship tank, modified from a British design, were built at Newport News, trained in Chesapeake Bay, and early in 1943 began crossing the Atlantic on their own bottoms, as the landing craft infantry did too. Landing craft's tank came over on the decks of landing ships, tank or on freighters. Admirals Connolly and Hall, who had specially interested themselves in these types, experimented with them to ascertain their capabilities, and used them extensively in Husky. According to Thucydides, the Greeks who invaded Syracuse in 413 BC had most to fear from the Sicilian cavalry, against which, for want of a landing ship horse, their only defence was archery. Enemy tanks, the modern cavalry, are now the bane of amphibious landings. In order to prevent their working havoc on the GLS, it was necessary to land our own tanks and anti-tank guns with or immediately after the assault troops. That was the main function of the landing ship tank and landing craft tank. These craft were supposed to be able to ground on a beach and lower their ramps, over which tanks, guns and vehicles could roll ashore. The landing craft infantry beached and then lowered bow gangways, not unlike the brows of a Greek byrami, for infantry to land without boating or swimming. Unfortunately, most of the Sicilian beaches were protected by sandbars with enough water to float landing craft, but not a landing ship tank. The Duke W, an amphibious truck which could carry 25 troops or 27 tons of cargo, swim in the water and roll over the land, and required only one driver, also made its European debut in Husky. The great advantage of the Duke W was its ability to carry supplies from a ship to an inland dump without handling at the water's edge. The Axis was partly, but not completely surprised by the Sicilian assault. Hitler, swallowing a clever British plant to the effect that the real objectives were Sardinia and Greece, dispatched reinforcements to both places. But Marshal Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, was not fooled and sent a panzer division to Sicily as reinforcement. That added up to 2 German and 4 Italian combat divisions, in addition to 6 Italian coastal divisions, which were composed mostly of overage Sicilian reservists. There were over 300,000 men under arms in Sicily when the Anglo-American Expeditionary Force landed on 10 July 1943, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had about 10 AM serviceable planes within flying distance of the landings. On the other hand, Mussolini prudently kept his navy in protected harbours, such as Spezia. The German navy was represented by only a few U-boats and motor torpedo boats, and the Italian Air Force consisted largely of obsolete planes. Another asset to the invaders was the friendly attitude of the Sicilians and of the Mafia, or Black Hand. Gangsters and peasants alike hated Germans, were fed up with the Duce, and looked on their invaders as liberators. Admiral Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force, mounted at or staged through 6 different harbours along the Algerian and Tunisian littoral, ran into a sharp and sudden mistral north of Malta that blew up a high-breaking sea. This tested the endurance of the new beaching craft and the seamanship of their crews. Both met it magnificently. Carrying to a lower level the diagram at the head of the last section, Hewitt's Western Naval Task Force was divided 3 ways from west to east. Rear Admiral Connolly's Joss Force to land Major General Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division on beaches near Licata, Rear Admiral John L. Hall's Dime Force to land Major General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division on beaches near Gela, and Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk's Cent Force to land Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley and 2nd Corps Staff, and Major General Troy Middleton's 45th Infantry Division on beaches near Skogliti. Connolly, Hall and Kirk, as well as Admiral Hewitt, were experienced practitioners of amphibious warfare. Kirk had relieved Hewitt as confiblant, and as such trained his Cent Force in Chesapeake Bay. Hall, who came to Africa as Hewitt's Chief of Staff, had been Confib Force Northwest African Waters since early in the year. Up to a certain point, the story of these 3 landings is similar. Although their targets were miles apart, the military objective was the same: to establish a beachhead as a base from which to begin the march on Palermo and Messina. It had to be deep enough so that boats, ships and beaches would be outside enemy artillery range. On the evening of 9 July, the Western Naval Task Force, still undetected, was fast approaching the Sicilian shore. Beacon submarines, to help the vessels find their targets with infrared blinkers, were stationed about 5 miles off each set of beaches. In addition, Joss Force had destroyer Bristol 5 miles south of the submarines, and a patrol craft south of her, 3 lampposts to help the new beaching craft find their way. There is nothing in warfare to be compared with the hushed tension of the final approach in a night landing. Everything ahead is uncertain. There is no sound but the rush of waters, the throbbing of your ship's engines and of your own heart. You can see nothing but the ship ahead and the ship astern. The shore, if dimly visible, is shrouded in darkness. A few mistakes on our part, or clever thrusts by the enemy, may utterly wreck a vast, long-planned effort. There can be no drawn battle, no half success in an amphibious landing. It is win all splendidly, or lose all miserably. The enemy was not entirely surprised, but unready. Many officers of Italian coastal divisions, in view of the foul weather, turned in, and German search radar crews could not believe the enormous blips they saw on their screens. Small groups of beach defenders commonly deserted their pillboxes in panic when they saw the imposing and terrifying spectacle revealed by the first light of dawn. There had been nothing like it in Sicilian history since the Athenian expedition against Syracuse, no less famous for its wonderful audacity and for the splendour of its appearance than for its overwhelming strength, as Thucydides wrote. As Sicilians later described the scene to me, there were thousands of vessels in the roadstead. One couldn't see the horizon for the ships. The Allies had ringed a good third of Sicily with a wall of ships. No power on earth could prevent them from establishing beachheads, and it would take more power than the Axis had to keep them from taking the island. Connolly's Joss landings around Licata were noteworthy for the skill with which the landing craft's infantry and landing craft's tank beached in rough surf to land troops and tanks, and for naval gunfire support. Every large troop unit carried a shore-fire control party, which communicated by walkie-talkie radio with a destroyer or cruiser of Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubos's support group, cruisers Brooklyn and Birmingham, destroyers Buck and Ludlow, and frequently asked them to put a few shells on a spot where the enemy showed resistance. By noon, General Truscott was setting up his command post in the city of Licata. Already 3,000 Italian troops had been taken prisoner. The Joss force landings were smooth and successful, securing the left flank of the Allied assault and a port for follow-up. Rear Admiral Hall's Dime Force, which landed around Gela, encountered the toughest opposition and had the satisfaction of repelling 2 enemy tank assaults with naval gunfire. Here, most of the troops came in big transports and were taken ashore in landing craft. The first boats hit the beach exactly at H-hour 2:45 a.m. Everything went smoothly until dawn brought enemy air attacks. At 4:58 a.m., just as daylight began to spread over the sea, destroyer Maddox, on anti-submarine patrol several miles offshore, was attacked by a Stuka. A bomb exploded under her propeller guard, demolishing the stern and exploding the after magazine. Within 2 minutes, Maddox rolled over and sank, taking down her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarsfield, and most of her crew. Cruisers of the Dime Force Support Group, without waiting for fire support parties to issue invitations, catapulted their float planes to look for targets. One of these cruisers was Boise, repaired better than new after her battering in the Battle of Cape Esperance, and with Captain L. Hewlett Thabord as commanding officer. The other was Savannah, Captain R. W. Carey. Since their float planes had no fighter protection, most of them were shot down by Messerschmitts, but one at 8:30 a.m. reported 2 columns of about 25 Italian tanks each approaching the beachhead. Boise's 6-inch fire stopped one column, and destroyer Shubrick deprived the other of several units. Boise also silenced a shore battery that was enfilading the beach, and Admiral Ramsey kindly lent Admiral Hall HM Monitor Abercrombie to plant a few 15-inch shells on Nissemi, 8 miles inland. Thus, naval gunfire played the role of the Athenian archers against Sicilian cavalry in the famous invasion of 413 BC. One of the bottlenecks in amphibious operations has always been the congestion of supplies on the beaches. Army shore parties are supposed to carry the bales, boxes, and other stuff to supply dumps, but they hate the job and never do it fast enough. By nightfall D-Day, the Gela beaches were so congested that some landing craft had to return to their ships fully loaded. Others, which had managed to find a spot to beach, swamped through their open ramps because nobody would help their exhausted crews to unload. The enemy had almost complete control of the air over the beachhead, while Army Air Force or Forces and Royal Air Force flew strategic. A renewal of tank counterattacks at daylight was certain, but how could they be met? Landing ship Tank 313, carrying all anti-tank guns of Dime Force, had been destroyed at sunset on D-Day by a Messerschmitt. Other landing ships, tank-carrying tanks, could not get into the beach over the bars. Thus, the main burden of supporting the 1st Infantry Division in a really tough assault by a German tank column on 11 July fell on the Navy. Intermittently, over a period of 10 hours, 2 cruisers and 8 different destroyers fired on enemy tanks and infantry, advancing or retreating, destroyed half the tanks and demoralized the foot soldiers. Next day, naval gunfire supported our own advancing troops up to 8 miles inland. So devastating in its effectiveness, wrote General Eisenhower, was this shooting, as to dispose finally of any doubts that naval guns are suitable for shore bombardment. On the other hand, the paratroops won naval converts owing to the magnificent job done by Colonel James M. Gavin's regimental combat team of the 82nd Airborne Division. This was the first troop airdrop ever attempted at night, so it is not surprising that the 3,400 paratroops were dispersed along 60 miles of coast. But a part of one battalion which dropped behind Gela held up a German tank column on D-Day, harassed the retreating tanks on the 11th, and greatly contributed to the confusion between the Italian and the German defenders. We shall later see Airborne playing a vital role in the Normandy operation. In Admiral Kirk's Cent Force area, centred on the fishing village of Skogliti, high surf and outlying rocks were very troublesome to landing craft. Here is a sample incident. A boat from Transport Thomas Jefferson, commanded by Ensign G.P. Limberis, seeking a small beach in pitchy darkness, hit instead a rocky point. The troops, understandably, flinched from debarking in heavy surf on a rock-bound coast. But after much persuasion, reported the ensign, every man in my boat was on the beach, and crew and myself salvaged the 2 .30 caliber machine guns and a few rounds of ammunition. 4 Italians who manned a nearby machine gun were so astounded at this exploit that they promptly surrendered. Presently Limberis and his men heard shouts and screams in the water. 2 boats in the second wave, following the same erroneous course, had collided and swamped when their coxswains sighted the rocks and tried to sheer off. The first-comers scrambled down the steep and slippery rocks and managed to pull 4 GLs out of the water, but some 38 others were drowned. The third boat wave, at 4:15 a.m., barely escaped crashing and put its troops ashore safely on the rocky point, but lost 5 boats out of 7. The combination of heavy surf, want of definite landmarks, and inexperienced boat crews made landing craft casualties in Cent area almost as great as in the Moroccan landings of Operation Torch. The saddest event in the American sector was the shooting down of transport aircraft towing gliders carrying American paratroops. General Ridgway decided on the morning of 11 July to lay a big airdrop on Forello, which, as he did not know, was already occupied by American troops. His opposite number ordered a similar one in the British sector. There was not enough time to inform ships and army units ashore what was coming. The route for the transport planes and gliders lay right along the battlefront and over the ships whose anti-aircraft gunners were trigger-happy after 2 days of frequent air attack. Between 9:50 p.m. and 11 p.m., the Germans sent in a heavy air raid, 24th of that busy day, wherein the Axis committed 381 planes against ships off the assault beaches. Right on top of that came our own transport planes. Recognition signals were of no avail in the tracer-filled night sky. Anti-aircraft gunners ashore and on shipboard fired at friend and foe alike. 23 of the 144 planes which took off from Tunisia failed to return, and 37 were badly damaged. Almost 100 officers and men were killed or missing. A special board was convened by General Eisenhower to study this airdrop, and a similarly shot-up one over the British sector. It concluded that these tragic fiascos were caused by not allowing sufficient time to notify friendly ground and naval forces, flying over them during an enemy bombing attack, and at such low altitudes as to make identification friend or foe inoperative. These errors were not repeated. In justice to the air forces, we must remember that their main efforts against enemy airfields and lines of communication were so successful that air attacks on the amphibious forces were kept to a minimum, and none were delivered in the American sector after 13 July. The British sector, lying nearer mainland airdromes, continued to catch it nightly under the waxing moon, and as soon as the United States naval forces came around to Palermo, the Luftwaffe found them again. For reasons of space, I shall have to pass rapidly over the British landings of Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay's Eastern Task Force, between Formiche, on the west side of Cape Passero, and Cassibile, not far south of Syracuse. The Royal Navy's part was conducted with the same verve and efficiency as that of the United States Navy. The British had the easier meteorological conditions for landing, as their beaches were sheltered from the wind on D-Day, but they suffered more from enemy air attack. The American troops met stouter initial opposition, but after 15 July it was the other way round. Although the British and Americans landed on different sections of the coast, a close coordination was maintained between upper levels of command, and the two navies got along so well that a more intimate intermingling could be attempted in the next operation. Before that could start, Sicily had to be conquered. On the night of 12 and 13 July, after the beachheads were secure and enemy dispositions had been felt out, General Alexander's staff drew up a plan and issued directives. Montgomery was to thrust one army corps due north to Catania, while a second corps took the road to Enna and continued to the north coast at San Stefano to split the island in half. Patton's 7th Army would pivot on its left and overrun the central and western parts of the island. In other words, Monty was to wield the sword and George hold the shield. This unfortunate reversal of the roles proper and congenial to their respective characters was the result of Alexander's belief that American troops were not much good. Marshal Kesselring flew to General Guzzoni's headquarters at Enna on 12 July to find out what was going on. What he saw and heard deflated his optimism. The Allied landings everywhere had been successful. In 2 days' time, 80,000 men and 8,200 vehicles, tanks and guns had been landed. The German tank attack had failed ignominiously. Syracuse and Augusta had fallen to the British. Several airfields were already in Allied possession. Kesselring realized that there was nothing left but to fight a delaying action. He flew back to Rome and informed Mussolini that owing to the failure of his troops to stop the landings, it would be impossible to defend Sicily. Il Duce beat his breast and bellowed, "It must not be, but it was." And 2 weeks later the King of Italy straightened his short back and fired Mussolini. His successor, Marshal Badoglio, issued a brash statement about prosecuting the war with renewed vigour, but nobody believed that, and he told the little king that the war was absolutely and completely lost. 7th Army overran the western half of the island in record time. General Patton made a triumphal entry to Palermo on 22 July, riding between cheering throngs, and appropriately set up 7th Army headquarters in the palace of 2nd Re Ruggiero, the 12th century Norman king. Only a few hours later, the United States Navy arrived at Palermo, in the shape of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 15, Lieutenant Commander Stanley M. Barnes. Next came Captain Charles Wellborn's Destroyer Squadron 8, Wainwright, Flag, and several minesweepers. On 27 July, when Palermo harbour was first opened to Allied shipping, Admiral Hewitt organised these and the few other United States warships left in Sicilian waters into General Patton's navy to support 7th Army. As such, it had plenty to do, defending Palermo from an Italian navy raid, giving gunfire support to Patton as he advanced along the coast, providing amphibious craft for leapfrog landings, and ferry duty for heavy artillery, supplies and vehicles to relieve congestion on the coastal road. Rear Admiral Davidson commanded the support force. This tall, lanky flag officer, firm in decision and quiet of speech, never lost his temper. He inspired confidence. His flagship Philadelphia, with cruiser Savannah and 6 destroyers, steamed into Palermo during the forenoon watch 30 July. There was no chance of their collecting barnacles on their bottoms. General Patton asked for gunfire support next day and was obliged with a vigorous bombardment of shore batteries near San Stefano. From Palermo, Patton pushed east along the coastal road to Messina, using the navy to make short hops from place to place along the shore, but the Germans always kept one jump ahead of him. In the British sector, Montgomery was held up for a week by stout German defence of the plains south of Catania. In contrast to Patton, Monty, as Admiral Cunningham has written, made no use of amphibious opportunities, and very little of naval gunfire support. Consequently, General Patton, approaching Messina by 2 legs of the triangle, reached it first, on 17 August. But that was slight satisfaction. As Montgomery's slow and cautious advance along the coast, gave the Axis sufficient time to evacuate 3 good German divisions with all their weapons and most of their armour across the Strait of Messina. The Italian army too got out. In the land campaign by 7th Army, it has been well said that the ordinary run-of-the-mine GI now proved himself to be a first-class fighting man. The dash to Palermo, the Battle of Troina, and other actions in Sicily deserve to be among the proudest in American military annals. One only regrets that, owing to General Alexander's bad judgment, General Patton was not allowed to wield the sword instead of the slow-moving, methodical Montgomery. Leadership in the Western Naval Task Force was superb. Admirals Hewitt, Kirk, Hall and Connolly, to mention only the force commanders, showed intelligence in planning and skill in execution that marked them for honours and promotion. Yet the heroes of the Western landings were the crews of the landing and beaching craft, mostly very young reservists, many of whom had never even smelled salt water before 1943. These were the last link in a chain that started in American shipyards and factories, which included military bases painstakingly developed in North Africa, warships and transports, and 3 reinforced army divisions, with their supplies, vehicles, armour and equipment. All these troops and the bulk of their material depended, to get ashore safely, on beaching or small landing craft. Boats under reserve ensigns or enlisted coxswains had to negotiate 5 miles or more of strange waters, often with nothing but a wobbly compass to guide them through the night, to locate targets in the dark, beach their craft, and provide their own support against enemy gunfire while discharging troops and equipment. Surprisingly few mistakes were made. The beaching craft, with slightly more experienced leadership, had even more complicated and difficult tasks. If these crews had failed, the entire American part of Operation Husky would have failed, and the British would have been left to carry the war into Sicily unsupported. All honour, then, to these lads of the last link, since they proved themselves to be brave, strong and resourceful. Although their names are not recorded on bronze tablets, let their deeds be kept in fresh memory by the nation and the cause that they served. We left the Pacific on 9 February 1943, with Guadalcanal secured. 3 weeks earlier the Papuan campaign had been concluded. General Eichelberger, whom MacArthur had ordered to take Buna or not come back alive, led his Australian and American troops through a stinking malarial jungle and captured Gona on 9 December and Buna on 2 January and Sanananda, 18 January 1943. The naval aspect of this campaign was limited to bringing supplies from Australia via Milne Bay to an Allied base on the north coast of Papua, mostly by small armed Australian and Dutch merchant vessels, covered by American PTs. Rear Admiral Barbay's 7th Amphibious Force was training in Australia, but as yet it had no landing ships, tank or other beaching craft. All this was part of Operation Watchtower, which started with Guadalcanal, and whose object was to breach the Bismarck Barrier, the route to Japan favoured by General MacArthur. He wished the entire weight of the Pacific Fleet to be placed under his command, to cover troop movements along this New Guinea-Mindanao axis to the Philippines. Admirals King and Nimitz did not deny the value of that route, but wished to use an alternate one as well, to project a series of amphibious operations across the Central Pacific via the Gilbert, Marshall, Caroline and Mariana Islands. Their chief argument against the MacArthur plan was very cogent. As long as the Micronesian spider webs which Japan had spread over the Central Pacific were in her possession, enemy air forces could attack everything that moved along the New Guinea-Mindanao axis. These webs must be swept up with the Pacific Fleet broom, and a second and shorter route opened to Tokyo. A third plan, which might have been incorporated with MacArthur's, never came off. This was for a British comeback through the Indian Ocean and the Straits of Malacca to recover Burma and Singapore and control the South China Sea. Admiral King was eager to have this done by Admiral Lord Mountbatten, the British commander in Southeast Asia, whom both he and General Marshall admired. Unfortunately, it was postponed again and again, because whenever Lord Louis managed to build up landing craft and naval forces, they were taken away from him to feed the hungry maw of the Mediterranean. The main thing in early 1943 was to get on with Operation Watchtower, but nothing substantial was done for 5 months. The Joint Chiefs of Staff could promise no reinforcement to the Pacific Fleet, while U-boats remained a major threat. Tunisia was still being fought over, and the invasion of Sicily was coming up. But the principal reason for this delay was the same shipping shortage that bedeviled the Allies in Europe, and lack of aircraft carriers. When the Essex-class carriers began to come out, in answer to the prayers of Pacific sailors, we were ready to go. During this pause, there were fleet and troop movements as far north as the Bering Sea. No operations in this region of almost perpetual mist and snow accomplished anything of importance or had any appreciable effect on the outcome of the war. It was a theatre of military frustration. Both sides would have done well to leave the Aleutians to the few Aleuts unfortunate enough to live there. But the Japanese, as part of the Midway Offensive, had occupied Attu and Kiska, the two westernmost islands, as northern anchors to their ribbon defence, and as such, American strategists felt obliged to set them adrift. For over 9 months after Midway, events in this sector were a sequence of naval bombardment by us which did no damage, reinforcement missions by the enemy which accomplished nothing, and operations by United States submarines usefully diminished the Japanese merchant marine. Finally, on 26 March 1943, a really interesting event broke: the Battle of the Komandorski Islands. A small task group under Rear Admiral Charles H. McMorris fought a retiring action against a Japanese force of twice its size and firepower. The battle lasted without a break for 3.5 hours of daylight. The contestants slugged it out with gunfire at ranges of 8 to over 12 miles, without intrusion by air power or submarines. It was a miniature version of the sort of fleet action that the Navy, after World War I, expected to fight in the next war, with the important difference that neither side did the other any great damage. Admiral McMorris's task group had been cruising on a north-south line west of Attu for several days in order to intercept Japanese reinforcement of that island. He flew his flag in 20-year-old light cruiser Richmond, Captain T.W. Waldschmidt. With him were heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, Captain Bertram J. Rogers, repaired and freshly overhauled since the Cape Esperance battle, and 4 destroyers under Captain Ralph S. Riggs. At 8 a.m. March 26, a clear, calm day with temperature just above freezing, this task group ran slap into Vice Admiral Hosogaya's northern area force of 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi, Flag, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, about halfway between Attu and Kamchatka. The ensuing action, fought south of the Komandorski Islands, resembled the Battle of the Java Sea a year earlier. Hosogaya here, like Takagi there, was escorting and covering a reinforcement group of transports and freighters, and McMorris here, like Dorman there, first tried to get at the transports, but soon had to fight for his life. The outcome was very different. At 8:40 a.m., before the American ships had had time to change from scouting line to battle order, the enemy opened fire on Richmond at 20,000 yards, made a close straddle on the second salvo, then shifted gunfire to Salt Lake City. Throughout the action, this heavy cruiser received almost all the enemy's attention. She commenced return fire with her forward turrets at 8:42 a.m., and at a range of over 10 miles made hits on Nachi with her 3rd and 4th salvos, starting fires that were quickly brought under control. Nachi now launched a salvo of 8 torpedoes, which failed to score because of the extreme range, and the same thing happened to all other Japanese torpedoes launched in this fight. Salt Lake was now doing some fancy shooting at long range, and all that time nimbly darting and pirouetting like a ballet dancer to throw off the enemy aim. Captain Rogers chased salvos with notable success. Flagship Richmond and the destroyers conformed their movements to hers. Old Swayback Maru, as the sailors called Salt Lake City, was queen of the North Pacific that day. The second Japanese heavy cruiser, Maya, at 9:10 a.m., made her first hit on Salt Lake. It failed to stop or even slow her down. 10 minutes later, she and Nachi were swapping punches at a range of almost 12 miles. McMorris now turned his force north, hoping to make an end run around the Japanese warships and get at the transports, but Hosogaya was too fast for him. At 10:02 a.m., Salt Lake briefly had steering trouble, and a few minutes later she took another hit. There was a big laugh on Richmond's bridge when the officer in tactical command received a message from Admiral Kincaid, at Adak, promising to get army bombers out to help him within 5 hours, and suggesting that a retiring action be considered. Retirement, indeed, was now the only thing to do. McMorris first steered west under good smoke cover, which the Japanese rangefinders, having no radar, were unable to penetrate. But this course carried the Americans nearer and nearer to the Japanese base at Paramushiro, so at 11 a.m. McMorris turned his force south to disengage. No sooner done than Salt Lake suffered a serious 8-inch hit which flooded the after-engine room. She continued firing at declining speed for 20 miles and almost 1 hour longer. Then she went dead in the water. McMorris reacted by closing in Richmond to make smoke and help defend Old Swayback, and, in a magnificent but desperate gesture, ordering 3 of his 4 destroyers to deliver a torpedo attack on the fast-approaching enemy. Everyone who could help damage control on board Salt Lake did, and everyone else prayed. Before the destroyers had been gone 5 minutes, what looked like a miracle occurred. Admiral Hosogawa broke off action and turned his entire force west, hotly pursued by Bailey, Coghlan and Monaghan. Hosogawa really funked out. He was anxious to get home. Smoke concealed from him Salt Lake's desperate plight, and he feared that American air bombers from Dutch Harbour would arrive shortly. Destroyer Bailey gave Natchez superstructure a good dusting with close-in 5-inch fire to firm up his decision to depart. It is no wonder that this Japanese admiral was shortly put on the beach. Salt Lake recovered propulsion as 8 bells struck, then shaped a course for Dutch Harbour and a repair base. Natchez, too, needed several jobs done on her, and as the Japanese transports also returned to Paramushiro, there was no doubt as to who won this battle. During the action, Salt Lake fired 832 rounds, Natchez 707 and Maya 904 rounds of 8-inch shell. Bailey, the only American destroyer to get close enough to the retiring enemy to use torpedoes, fired 5, which missed. The Japanese ships fired 43 and all missed. So this battle deserves a place in the history of naval warfare as the last heavy gunfire daylight action, with no interference by air power, submarines or torpedoes. The demonstration of superior gunnery was tremendously heartening to the United States Navy. Before leaving Alaska's dreary shores for warmer climes, we must briefly mention the recovery of Attu. Amphibious Force North Pacific was set up to accomplish this, under Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell. The 7th Infantry Division United States Army had the unhappy ground assignment. Battleships Pennsylvania and Nevada emerged from naval shipyards in time to act as support group with Idaho, and Sock McMorris was back again, in light cruiser Raleigh, commanding a covering group. The landings on 11 May 1943 were successful, but the Japanese garrison fought desperately, culminating in a 1,000-man screaming self-terminatory charge on 29 May. A big operation to take Kiska was laid on for late July, but the Japanese fooled us by evacuating their 5,000-man garrison under fog cover, leaving only 3 yellow dogs to contest the American landing. It was bad strategy to throw such heavy forces into capturing a few square miles of muskeg, at a time when troops and ships were desperately needed in the South and Southwest Pacific. Ironically, one of the main reasons for these efforts in the Aleutians was the desire of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to expedite aid to Russia, in the expected event of her going to war with Japan. During the rest of the war, the Aleutians offer little of interest. Harassing air raids on Paramushiro were varied by occasional shore bombardments, and feeble Japanese retaliatory raids on Attu, Kiska and Adak. But there was a constant improvement both of bases and of flying efficiency in these difficult northern areas, and that was all to the good. For it may well be that in the future the Bering, not the Caribbean, will be America's Sea of Destiny. In any case, it was wonderful practice ground for armed forces. After a tour of duty in the Aleutians, every other field of action seemed good. About 9,000 infantrymen and marines, lifted from New Caledonia, landed unopposed on the Russell Islands, 30 miles west of Cape Esperance, on 21 February 1943. This overstuffed affair might well have been omitted. After the Japanese were thrown out of Buna and Gona, they began to strengthen their garrisons at Lae and Salamaua on Huon Gulf, General MacArthur's next objective.